The private room of the exclusive Bellagio Club buzzed with hushed conversations and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. Gold light from 1,000 tiny chandeliers bathed everything in opulence, every detail curated to perfection, just the way Grant Ellis liked it. He sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, his posture relaxed, his charm effortless. At his side, Veronica beamed at him with adoration in her eyes. Her red silk dress shimmered as she leaned in, her laughter a silvery note that drifted. Through the air, Grant raised his glass. To new ventures and unforgettable nights, he toasted, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. The small group of carefully selected colleagues and investors raised their own glasses, the warmth of success and secrecy binding them all together. Veronica's hand rested lightly on Grant's arm, her nails painted the color of blood. "You always know how to make an evening memorable," she purred, her gaze lingering on his lips. He smirked, his confidence unshakable. "I pride myself on that," he replied, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of power. The room felt small and safe, his kingdom wrapped around him like an expensive suit. But then the door creaked, a sound out of place in the curated symphony of whispers and laughter. It swung open slowly, and all eyes turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the golden glow, was Julia. Her presence was a thunderclap in the hush of the room. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned, a fury that no amount of makeup or diamonds could hide. One hand rested protectively on the swell of her belly, the other clenched at her side. The baby, a promise Grant had once made, was now the silent witness to this moment. "Grant," she said, her voice low but steady. The tremor in her tone only amplified the strength behind it. "I didn't believe it until now." Her eyes flicked to Veronica and back, the betrayal sharp as a blade. Grant's face paled, his mask of composure slipping for the first time. "Julia," he began, but the words faltered. Veronica shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between them, the seductive smile fading from her lips. "Who is she?" she whispered, though the answer was written on every face. The tension crackled in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. Every breath, every heartbeat, felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Grant's carefully constructed empire of secrets wavered as his wife's eyes bore into him, unflinching, demanding truth. And for the first time in a long time, Grant Ellis felt fear. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from. The room seemed to hold its breath as Julia took a step forward, her chin high, her voice unwavering. "You think you can build your empire on lies and betrayal," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "But I won't be a part of your games anymore." Her eyes met Veronica's, a woman caught in a web she didn't fully understand, and then turned back to Grant, her gaze hard as steel. This was just the beginning. Julia's words hung in the air like a sword, their edge slicing through the carefully crafted atmosphere of wealth and success. Grant's colleagues shifted uncomfortably, their laughter evaporating like morning mist. Veronica's hand trembled on her wineglass, her eyes darting between Grant and his wife. The tension was a live wire, sparking with every breath. Grant's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Julia," he hissed, his voice low and controlled, the way he'd always managed her behind closed doors. "This is neither the time nor the place for your dramatics." Julia's laugh was hollow, a brittle sound that trembled on the edge of tears. "Dramatics!" she spat, her voice shaking. "I'm carrying your child while you wine and dine your mistress." Her hand curled protectively around her belly. "How long have you been lying to me? How many dinners like this have there been?" The guests looked down at their plates, the room shrinking around them. Veronica shifted, the red silk of her dress whispering like a secret. "Grant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You told me." He shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Veronica, stay out of this," he snapped, the calm mask he'd worn for so long cracked, revealing the rage simmering beneath. Julia's tears finally fell, carving lines through the makeup she'd so carefully applied. You think you can control everything, she said, her voice low, but strong. But you can't control me. Not anymore. Her gaze was unflinching, meeting his with a strength that made the room seem smaller. Grant stood, his movements sharp and jerky. His hands balled into fists at his sides. You're humiliating me, he growled, his eyes wild. In front of my colleagues, my investors. Do you know what this will do to me? Julia shook her head slowly. It's always about you, isn't it? She said, her voice trembling. Your image, your money, your precious empire built on lies. A silence descended, heavy and suffocating. Every eye in the room watched, frozen between disbelief and horror. Grant's face contorted, rage and fear twisting his features into something unrecognizable. And then, without warning, his hand flew. The crack of palm-meeting cheek echoed like a gunshot, slicing the silence. Julia's head snapped to the side, her hair flying, the red mark already blooming on her pale skin. A collective gasp rose from the table, the sound of a world shattering. She clutched her cheek, tears mixing with anger as her eyes met his, eyes that once held love but now reflected only betrayal. How dare you, she whispered, her voice raw. Veronica rose, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Grant, she said, her voice shaking. What have you done? Grant's breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as if the slap had cost him his last defense. The man who had controlled every room now stood stripped bare, his violence exposed like a wound. Julia straightened, her hand trembling but her chin high. I will never let you hurt me again, she said, her voice trembling with power. She turned her gaze to Veronica, a quiet understanding passing between them. Two women who had seen the truth at last. And in that moment, Grant Ellis realized the empire he'd built on lies and manipulation had begun to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Rain lashed the city streets like 1,000 tiny knives as Julia stumbled from the restaurant, her cheeks burning with the sting of Grant's hand and the weight of his betrayal. The cold night air bit into her skin, but she welcomed the chill. It was a pain she could trust, unlike the man who'd shattered her world. Her steps were uneven, her heels clicking on the wet pavement as she turned a corner and ducked into a narrow alley. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a silent cry of everything she'd refused to believe for so long. Her hand hovered over her cheek, the imprint of his slap a raw reminder of his power, and her own mistake in loving him. She reached her small apartment in a rundown building far from the luxury she'd once called home. The key trembled in her fingers, the lock clicking open like a sigh. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and rain-dampened clothes, but it was hers, a place where his lies couldn't follow. She sank onto the couch, her arms wrapping around her belly as if to shield the child inside from the world's cruelty. Tears blurred her vision as memories flooded her mind. Grant's promises of forever, the way he'd whispered her name in the dark, the bright smile he'd worn like a mask. Forever. Julia, he'd said once, his voice smooth as silk. I'll always take care of you. The memory turned sour in her mind, the words now as hollow as his promises. She remembered the red flags she'd ignored, the late nights at the office, the business trips that stretched for days, the way he'd turned every question into an accusation. Don't you trust me? He'd say, his tone icy. And she had, because love had blinded her to the poison beneath his charm. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through old photos. The vacations, the parties, the smile she'd forced for the world. A laugh bubbled up, bitter, sharp. She had played her part in his perfect life, the devoted wife, the silent supporter, the one who never asked too many questions. But tonight had changed everything. The memory of his hand across her face burned like a brand. It wasn't just a slap. It was the truth slamming into her, stripping away every illusion. She saw now what she'd refused to see for too long. His empire was built on control, manipulation, and fear. And she'd been his willing prisoner. A steely resolve settled in her chest, cooling the fire of her anger into something harder, more focused. She couldn't let him win. Not again. not with their child's future at stake. She wiped her tears, her voice steady as she spoke to the empty room. "No more," she whispered. "No more lies, no more fear. He'll learn what it means to betray the woman who trusted him." Outside, the rain softened, a gentle patter that whispered of renewal. Julia lifted her chin, her gaze steady. The battle had begun, and this time she would fight. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the city slick with reflections of neon lights and broken dreams. Veronica stood under the awning of the restaurant, arms folded tight across her chest, the cold seeping into her bones. She could still hear the echo of Grant's hand meeting Julia's cheek, the sharp crack that had cut through the laughter like a gunshot. Her heart raced, her mind a jumble of questions and doubt. She had believed in him, his charm, his promises of a life she'd never dared to dream. Grant Ellis, the man who had swept her into a world of luxury and whispered secrets, who'd made her feel like she was the only one who mattered. But tonight that man had shattered before her eyes, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Footsteps approached, heavy and uneven. She turned to see Grant emerging from the side door, his hair damp and his face pale. His eyes found hers, and for a moment the mask slipped, a flicker of desperation beneath the confident facade. He reached for her hand, his grip cold and trembling. "Veronica," he murmured, his voice low and urgent. "Come with me, we can't talk here." She pulled her hand back, the warmth of his touch now a poison she couldn't trust. "What was that, Grant?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "You hit her, your wife, and she's pregnant. How could you—" "Listen to me," he cut in, his tone sharp, his eyes wild. "She's been unstable for months. She's tried to ruin me before. He gestured vaguely toward the restaurant. "This was her way of humiliating me, of trying to tear down everything I've built." Veronica's chest tightened. "She didn't look unstable," she whispered. "She looked like a woman who's been hurt." Grant's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "You don't know her like I do," he snapped. Then his expression softened, the practiced charm slipping back into place like a mask. "Veronica, please," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a silky murmur. "I need you. I can't fight her alone. She wants to destroy me, to take everything I've worked for. You're the only one I can trust." The words tangled around her, heart, old feelings of loyalty and fear rising to the surface. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man who had held her so tenderly in the dark couldn't be the monster she'd glimpsed tonight. But the memory of Julia's tear-streaked face wouldn't leave her. "She's carrying your child," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. "How can you justify this?" Grant's eyes glittered, cold and hard. "It's complicated," he said, his voice low. "Everything I've built, everything I've done, it was for us, Veronica, for the life we could have together." Took her hand again, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "Don't let her lies ruin what we have." Veronica's mind spun, caught between doubt and desire, between truth and the illusion she'd once embraced. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the pavement like a warning. Grant's grip tightened. "Trust me," he whispered. And in that fragile, dangerous moment, Veronica realized that the man she thought she loved might not exist at all. Morning light crept through the curtains of Julia's apartment, painting the worn walls in pale gold. She sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Sleep had eluded her, the events of the night replaying in her mind like a broken record. The restaurant's gasps, the sting of Grant's hand, the raw disbelief in Veronica's eyes. She rested a protective hand on her swollen belly. "We deserve better," she whispered, her voice hoarse but resolute. No matter how much fear rattled in her chest, she wouldn't let her child grow up in the shadow of Grant's power. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and polished wood. Julia's heart raced as she sat across from Ms. Carver, a woman with sharp eyes and a quiet strength. Papers rustled between them, evidence of a life she'd tried so hard to protect. "Grant Ellis," Ms. Carver said, her voice measured. "You're aware he's one of the most influential men in the city? Ties to judges, politicians, the media?" She paused, studying Julia. This won't be easy. Julia lifted her chin. Nothing with Grant has ever been easy, she replied, her voice trembling but strong. I believed his lies for too long. I let him control me, but I won't let him control our child's life. Ms. Carver nodded, her pen tapping against the desk. We can build a case, she said. Assault, emotional abuse, financial manipulation. But it won't be quick, and it won't be clean. Men like him, she shook her head. They fight dirty. Julia's stomach knotted, but she met the lawyer's gaze without flinching. I know, she said. But I have to do this. For my baby. For me. Ms. Carver leaned back in her chair, a hint of admiration softening her features. Then we'll do it, she said. I'll need everything you have, texts, emails, financial records, anything that proves a pattern of abuse. Julia's mind raced, sifting through memories like broken glass. The late-night calls, the bank, statements she wasn't allowed to question, the bruises hidden behind makeup. I have some, she said, her voice low. I'll find the rest. Ms. Carver's expression turned grim. Be careful, Julia. He'll come after you any way he can. He'll use his money, his influence, even your child if he thinks it'll stop you. A shiver ran down Julia's spine, but she straightened her shoulders. Let him try, she said. I won't be his victim anymore. Outside, the city hummed with life, the noise of traffic and voices blending into a single, unstoppable tide. Julia stepped into the sunlight, the warmth on her skin a promise she clung to. She felt lighter, her fear transforming into something fierce and unbreakable. She thought of Veronica's eyes, the doubt and pain they'd shared. She thought of Grant's face, his charm crumbling like a mask in the rain. She thought of the child growing inside her, innocent and waiting, and she knew that no matter how hard the fight would be, she wouldn't back down. Morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Grant's mansion, casting a golden glow on the polished marble floors. The house, usually a fortress of luxury and control, now felt like a stage for the crumbling of his empire. Grant sat in his study, his fingers tapping restlessly on the glass-topped desk. The lawyer's call from earlier still echoed in his mind. They're building a case, Grant. You need to get ahead of this. But he'd always been ahead, always in control. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, it swung open. 2 uniformed officers entered, their presence sharp and unyielding. Behind them, Detective Ramos, with his steely eyes and calm authority, stepped forward. Grant Ellis, he said, his voice a steady current in the charged air. We have a warrant for your arrest. Charges include assault, tax fraud, and embezzlement. Grant's eyes widened, his hands tightening into fists. This is a mistake, he snapped, his voice dripping with arrogance. You can't come into my home like this. I know people. Detective Ramos held up a hand, his face impassive. You can save it for the court, he said, signaling to the officers. One officer moved forward, handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. Grant rose abruptly, knocking his chair to the floor. This is a setup, he shouted, his face flushed with rage. Julia's behind this. She's a liar. She's trying to ruin me. From the foyer, Veronica watched, her face pale and streaked with tears. The man she thought she loved now stood, revealed, a master manipulator undone by his own actions. Her hand covered her mouth as a sob escaped. The illusion she had clung to crumbled like sand. Julia's words from the night before echoed in her mind. You think he's telling you the truth? Ask him about the offshore accounts. Ask him about the threats. She had wanted to believe Grant. But now, watching him fight the inevitable, she saw the man beneath the charm. The officers moved swiftly, securing the handcuffs around Grant's wrists. The click of metal on bone was a final, inescapable sound. Cameras outside the mansion's gates flashed like lightning, reporters shouting questions as the front doors opened. Detective Ramos led Grant out, his head held high despite the chaos around him. You have the right to remain silent, he intoned. the words practiced but heavy. Grant's eyes darted to the cameras, searching for an ally, but found only the cold lens of the truth he could no longer hide. Veronica followed at a distance, her heels clicking on the marble like an accusation. Her tears blurred the scene, but she forced herself to watch. She needed to see the end, needed to witness the man she thought she loved, stripped of his lies. Grant turned his head, his eyes meeting Veronica's. For a heartbeat, his arrogance faltered, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "Veronica," he called, his voice hoarse. "You know me. Tell them this is a mistake." She shook her head slowly, her tears falling like rain. "I thought I did," she whispered. "But I was wrong." As the police car door shut with a heavy finality, Veronica wrapped her arms around herself. The cameras continued to flash, the mansion's grandeur now a backdrop to a tragedy she had never seen coming. The courthouse was a fortress of cold marble and echoing footsteps, every surface polished to a gleam that felt clinical and unfeeling. Julia stood near the wooden railing, her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly. The child within her was a reminder of why she was here, a testament to the strength she had fought so hard to reclaim. The room hummed with tension, the air thick with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Reporters hovered like vultures at the back, their cameras hidden but their eyes hungry for every tremor in the drama unfolding. At the defense table, Grant sat beside his high-priced lawyer, his once confident posture slumped. His eyes darted around the room, seeking an ally but found none. The tailored suit he wore looked too crisp, too practiced, like armor that no longer fit. Julia's lawyer, Ms. Carver, leaned forward, her voice steady and unwavering. "Your Honor, we will now call our next witness, Veronica Hayes." A hush fell over the room as Veronica rose, her face pale, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She avoided Grant's gaze as she took the stand, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible. The oath felt heavier than she'd expected, the truth pressing down on her like a weight. Ms. Carver approached, her tone gentle but firm. "Ms. Hayes, can you describe your relationship with Mr. Ellis?" Veronica's voice cracked, but she found her strength. I believed we were building a future together," she said, her gaze fixed on some distant point. "He told me his marriage was over, that Julia was unstable, that she was dangerous." Julia clenched her jaw, fighting back tears. The lies, so carefully woven, still cut deep. "And when did you realize that wasn't true?" Ms. Carver asked, her tone pressing gently. Veronica's eyes flicked to Grant, who sat rigid, his jaw set. "The night Julia came to the restaurant," she whispered. "I saw the look on her face, the pain, and then he hit her." Her voice broke and she wiped at her tears. "I realized then, he wasn't who I thought he was." Grant shifted, his lawyer leaning in to whisper urgently, but the courtroom belonged to Veronica now. "Did Mr. Ellis ever threaten you or manipulate you?" Ms. Carver continued. Veronica nodded slowly. "He said if I left him, he'd ruin me, that no one would believe me. He promised me the world if I stayed." She took a shaky breath. "I believed him. I was a fool." Julia's heart ached for the other woman, caught in the same web of lies she'd escaped. She felt a silent kinship, a bond forged in betrayal. The judge's gaze was cold, his gavel resting like a promise on the bench. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes," he said. "You may step down." Veronica left the stand, her steps unsteady but resolute. She paused near Julia, her eyes meeting hers with a silent apology. Julia nodded, her hand resting on her belly, a gesture of forgiveness. Ms. Carver rose, her voice strong. "Your Honor, we now call Julia Ellis to the stand." Julia took a deep breath, standing tall as she walked to the witness box. Every step echoed with the weight of her story, the pain she'd carried for too long. She placed her hand on the Bible, her voice steady as she spoke the oath. "Mrs. Ellis," Ms. Carver began, "please tell the court about the events that brought us here." Julia's voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. She spoke of the lies, the manipulation, the night at the restaurant, the slap that had ended her silence forever. She spoke of the threats, the isolation, the fear that had shadowed every step. The courtroom held its breath as she finished, her tears falling freely now. She looked at Grant, his mask gone, his eyes empty. "And that," she said, her voice, breaking but unbowed, "is why I refuse to be silent any longer." Veronica's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles white against the polished wood. The courtroom lights felt too bright, casting every tear, every quiver of her lip into sharp relief. She drew a shaky breath, trying to summon the strength she'd felt so sure of before she'd stepped into this place. "Ms. Hayes," the prosecutor said gently, her voice firm but not unkind, "did you know that Mr. Ellis was still married when you began your relationship with him?" Veronica's eyes darted to Grant, who sat stone-faced at the defense table, his lawyer's hand resting on his arm like a silent warning. She hesitated, her lips trembling. I didn't at first," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He told me they were separated, that she was unstable, dangerous. I believed him." A single tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. Her voice cracked as she continued. "When I saw her that night at the restaurant, She choked on the memory of Julia's tear-streaked face, the raw pain she'd witnessed. "I realized everything he said was a lie." Julia sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and unflinching. She felt the rawness of Veronica's confession, but she also saw the weight of betrayal in the other woman's eyes, a betrayal that went beyond just her and Grant. It was the betrayal of trust itself, the realization that the man they both thought they knew was a stranger all along. The prosecutor leaned in. "Ms. Hayes, did Mr. Ellis ever make threats to keep you silent?" Veronica nodded, her breath shuddering. "Yes," she said. He said if I ever turned on him, he'd make sure I regretted it. He told me no one would believe me. Over him. That he'd ruin me." She turned her tearful eyes to Julia. "I was so afraid. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how." Julia's heart ached, but she refused to let pity cloud her resolve. She'd been there too, trapped in a web of manipulation and gaslighting. But she knew now that strength came from facing the truth, no matter how broken it left you. "Thanks, you, Ms. Hayes," the prosecutor said, nodding respectfully. "No further questions." Veronica stepped down, her legs weak, her gaze meeting Julia's for a brief silent moment. It was not an apology in words, but in the raw honesty of her eyes, a woman broken but no longer willing to hide. Julia met her gaze with a nod of quiet understanding. Two women wronged by the same man, finally seeing each other clearly. The judge's gavel struck the wood, the sharp sound echoing through the hushed room. "We will recess until tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice firm. "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Julia rose, one hand on her belly, the other wiping a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. Veronica lingered, near the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Julia paused as she passed her, her voice soft but strong. "We both deserve better than his lies," she said. "We're stronger than him." Veronica's eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the cold wind carried the scent of rain. Julia stepped into the night, feeling the burden of the trial but also the freedom of the truth. She knew tomorrow would bring its own battles. But tonight, she had taken one step closer to justice. The courthouse buzzed with a nervous energy, every whispered conversation and shifting chair a drumbeat in the tense silence. Julia sat with her lawyer, her hands folded tightly on her lap, her thumb tracing circles over the curve of her belly. Each movement was a silent prayer, for justice, for closure, for the chance to rebuild what Grant had tried so hard to break. The jury had been deliberating for hours, each minute stretching like a lifetime. Grant sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, his face a carefully composed mask of arrogance. cracking around the edges like old porcelain. The door to the jury room creaked open, and 12 solemn faces filed into the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck, the sound sharp and final. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. A hush fell, every breath held tight in the chest. The jury foreman, an older woman with steel-gray hair and kind eyes, stood and cleared her throat. "We have, Your Honor." Julia's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She squeezed her lawyer's hand, her own fingers trembling. Across the room Veronica sat, her eyes locked on the floor, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The foreman's voice shook as she read the verdict. "On the count of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of tax fraud, guilty. On the count of embezzlement, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom like a wave of disbelief and relief. Julia felt her knees weaken, but she held herself steady, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with tears. This time not of pain, but of triumph. Grant's mask crumbled, his jaw slackened, his eyes darting wildly, searching for an exit that no longer existed. The lawyer beside him leaned in, his words low and hurried, but Grant only shook his head, the color draining from his face. The empire he'd built on lies and manipulation had turned to ashes in a single moment. The judge's gaze was unyielding. "Mr. Ellis," he intoned, "you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled, but know this, justice will be served." Julia's tears spilled freely now, warm and unstoppable. She cradled her belly, her heart swelling with the knowledge that she had fought for this moment, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. She had faced the man who had tried to destroy her, and she had won. Veronica's eyes met hers across the room. There was no hatred there, only shared sorrow and quiet strength. Two women who had refused to be broken, even when the world had tried to shatter them. Grant's voice rose, ragged and desperate. "Julia, please. This is a mistake. You have to believe me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I did this for us, for you and the baby." Julia met his gaze, her eyes steady and cold. "You did this for yourself," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "And now you'll pay the price." The judge's gavel struck once more, the sound a promise of finality. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand firm on Grant's shoulder. Cameras flashed, capturing the fallen millionaire in handcuffs. Julia closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath as if letting go of a lifetime of fear. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time she felt free. The sun hung high above the courthouse steps, its rays warm and golden as Julia emerged into the bustling city. The air smelled of possibility, carrying with it the scent of hot pavement, blooming flowers and new beginnings. She paused for a moment, feeling the cool breeze brush her hair back, the light on her face like a benediction. Her hand rested gently on the swell of her belly, a promise she had carried through every storm, every betrayal, every courtroom battle. This child was her anchor and her future, the life that had given her the strength to fight for the truth. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung open. Veronica stepped out, her eyes red-rimmed but no longer brimming with tears. She hesitated on the threshold, as if afraid to step into the world she'd helped to unravel. Slowly, she walked over to Julia, her steps tentative, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. "Julia," she began, her voice fragile, threaded with uncertainty. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For believing him. For everything." She looked away, shame etching lines into her smooth features. "I didn't know. Not really." Julia studied her for a long moment. In Veronica's eyes she saw a reflection of herself, someone who'd been charmed, manipulated, and left to pick up the pieces. But she also saw a woman who had chosen to tell the truth even when it meant standing alone. She nodded slowly, her lips curving into a small, understanding smile. "It's not your fault. Julia said softly. We both trusted the wrong man, but that doesn't mean we're broken. It means we survived. Veronica's eyes widened, relief and gratitude flooding her face. She reached out, hesitant, and Julia took her hand, squeezing it gently. For a brief, quiet moment, two women who had been strangers stood together, their shared pain binding them in a way that no man could ever break. They released hands, the connection lingering even as they stepped apart. Veronica straightened, her shoulders back, her head high. Thank you, she whispered. Julia watched as Veronica walked away, each step carrying her toward her own healing. She turned her gaze to the horizon, the city skyline shimmering in the sunlight. The past no longer held her captive. Its chains had shattered in that courtroom. She thought of the nights she'd spent alone, the weight of fear pressing down like a stone. She thought of Grant's charm and his cruelty, his empire of lies, now crumbling into dust. And she thought of the baby, the life she'd fought for with every ounce of her strength. You and me, kiddo, she murmured, her hand on her belly, her voice trembling with hope. We're going to be just fine. A breeze lifted her hair, carrying away the last remnants of a life she no longer recognized. She breathed deeply, inhaling the scent of freedom, the promise of tomorrow. And as she took her first steps into the sunlight, Julia knew she wasn't just leaving the courthouse behind. She was leaving behind the woman who had believed the lies, the woman who had accepted less than she deserved. She was walking toward the woman she had become, stronger, braver, and unbreakable.